This is about the I'm going to focus on the electoral. I know it says Supreme Court Electoral College. I'm going to discuss more the Electoral College than the Supreme Court. There seems to be a lot of confusion as to what this is, let alone why we have it. You know, what is the Electoral College? Really isn't all that confusing once you understand the mechanics, and it's not really truly difficult because it's in Article 2, Section 1 of the United States Constitution, when the founders put together what is really the republic. You know, number one. You hear this day in, day out. The American democracy, the democracy. You heard presidents say this. You hear your elected officials say this. The word democracy is not in the Constitution once. Doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. What does exist in the Constitution is if any territory becomes a state, it will have a Republican form of constitution. Your founders were not fans of democracy. They truly weren't. And interesting here, and I pulled these out because I thought these would be interesting. Edmund Randolph once stated, saying to the convention, the Constitutional Convention, that the evils from which the country suffered originated from, and he put in quotes here, the turbulence and follies of democracy. Eldridge Gary, speaking of democracy, as the worst of all political evils. Roger Sherman, remember him from Connecticut? Roger Sherman, saying that the people should have as little to do as may about the government. These people don't trust you. They didn't trust the common man. George Washington, the presiding officer, urging the delegates not to produce a document of which they themselves would not approve simply in order to please the people. Interesting, they didn't have as much of a regard for the common man. They didn't. Some of them really outright didn't respect the intelligence. For instance, Alexander Hamilton, who in the Federalist noted that, you know, in the Constitution, it says that the electors will exist. However, the states will choose how the electors are to be chosen. This was a sop to states' rights. You know, consider for a moment, when you go back to your Declaration of Independence, you're talking about 13 independent, considered themselves autonomous colonies. You know, really, some of them had different traditions, they have different economies. Sure, most people living on a farm, I'll give you that. You didn't have as much slavery up north as you did down south. And so what does somebody in South Carolina have in common with somebody in Massachusetts? However, when they begin to organize to throw off the crown, what is one of the major inducements of your Declaration of Independence? It's a unifier. Notice, please, that there are 56 signatures from 13 colonies on that document. Yet keep in mind, you're talking about a war that's going to be fought by 13 independent entities whose really only commonality at this point is to get rid of the crown. Throw them out. But what happens after that? Okay, now you're going to get to the point where in between 1780 and 1783, you have uprisings in the Continental Army. Actually, outright mutinies, which George Washington's going to have to put down. 1783, Shays' Rebellion. You know, a lot of this is really not discussed. And this idea of democracy really, I won't say terrifies some of your founders, but makes them uneasy. That the common man cannot really rule himself. And so here you have some of your consent to the governed. You find that in the Declaration of Independence. You find that in references to the Constitution, consent to the governed. The people okay the laws. Yet at the same time, the people can't govern themselves. How's that going to work? And so you have somebody like James Madison, who is really the philosopher here of your Constitution. He's really the philosopher. And he's the one who writes in Federalist number 51. You know, if men were, get this, if men were angels, they wouldn't need a government. But men are not angels. They need to be governed. But then again, who governs the excess? Who prevents the excess of government. Maybe the people, but who checks the people? This is the chicken versus the egg, which came first. This is where you're getting to. And so going back to people like Henry St. John Bolingbroke in England, where you really can't trust the common man, yet at the same time you have to accommodate the common man. Now, I know getting into some of these founders, and I'm not going to run away with this, take somebody like a George Washington, who was a big landowner. All right, I'll give you that. But at the same time, Americans don't understand, I don't think Americans really appreciate this as much as they do, that George Washington didn't make a play to take control of the country. He led the army, and the army was undying, many in the army were undyingly loyal to him. And some even urged him to march on Philly. He refused. He's not an Oliver Cromwell. He's not a Julius Caesar. He's not a Napoleon. I want to go home. Well, no, you got to stick around. So he stuck around and became president. First term. I want to go home. No, you got to stick around. So he became the second term. Then he went home. But the fact of the matter is, this helps to pass on a tradition we've had, at least up till now, the peaceful transfer of power. And a lot of that is because the people themselves were allowed to take part in government. But at the same time, you have to check the excesses of the few, the wealthy. And it's like anything else. Even Gouverneur Morris once explained that wealth can be like a drug. It can get people to want to dominate. And the more they dominate, the more they want. Yet again, with the people, yes, you got to give the people a semblance in this rule. You have to have them participate. But they can't govern themselves. Now we're back again to the chicken and the egg. And so when they begin to draw up this thing known as the Constitution, they're going to draw up three branches of government. The judiciary, which even from the beginning to today, you don't elect. They're appointed for you. A chief executive, which after all the fuss and feathers at the Constitutional Convention, some even having titles for our leader as long as a tabletop, they settle on a single term known as the president. Although some people call him the chief executive. Then we had the legislative branch. And that was interesting that the discussions that went on with that, originally there was supposed to only be one house in the legislative branch. However, it dawned on some of your founders, well, if we have one house in the legislative branch, supposing that house becomes dominated by a single individual from the states, well, you got a chief executive. Now what happens? Competition for power here? No, let's have a second house to check the first house. And so you're going to have a two-house branch. Well, we can call the Senate a house, but you're going to have the Senate and then the House of Representatives. Now, the House of Representatives is really called the People's House. Why? You've elected them from the beginning. Each serves 2 years. The Senate, keep in mind with the Senate, senators are in for 6 years. When the country was founded, the common man did not vote for the senators. The senators were voted for and applied by the state legislators. But again, keeping in mind, going back to understanding states' rights, it was viewed at the time that per states' rights, that the state legislators who are voted for in these individual states by the voters, they will represent the voter and apply the two senators. Now, that will be changed in 1913. And in 1913, an amendment will be applied to the Constitution, giving the people the right to vote for their 6-year senators. So from 1787 to 1913, people didn't vote for their senators. They were applied by your state legislators. Again, this is part of the state's rights. And again, you're seeing with people able to vote for their senators, that now the original republic is being, if you want to use the term, dismembered as we go along. Keep in mind, we're talking about a country in 1787, 1789, with very much restricted suffrage. You had to be a white male property owner to vote. Even if you were a poor white man in a little village or town and you didn't own property, guess what? You're joining the ranks of women, Indians, blacks. You can't vote. So suffrage was very restricted here. You had to be a property owner. At the same time, you have somebody like a John Adams who's saying the wide ownership of land is conducive to a functioning system of representative government. In other words, manifest destiny. The more land that is owned by people, then they are part of what? The voting public. You got more people taking part. But of course, that works for the white man, but who are the people taking it on the chin here? The Indian. They're losing their land as we spread. What's good for one's not good for another here. But as they're putting this together here, you will have your judicial branch headed by the Supreme Court. You will have your chief executive, who's the president, and also now the legislative branch, which is now the Senate and the House of Representatives. However, when it came to voting, again, like I mentioned, the 2-year rep, you always voted for that person from day one. The senators, again, were applied by the state legislators. But the president, sure, we're going to have a popular vote, but the common man has to be checked. Now, keep in mind when we get to the electors here, at one point, there was some who were beginning to have second thoughts about the electors. But they went back to having the electors when they saw what happened to the French Revolution. When the French Revolution descended into extreme violence. And they thought, no, we have to maintain the electors because the common man cannot rule himself. We don't want the same thing happening here. And so when you go back, now when they're discussing this, how are we going to have voting here? Interesting what some of your founders are coming up with. It's fascinating. At one point, they thought maybe Congress should choose the president. Congress should vote for the president, just those members of Congress. However, that was shot down because they thought that might create hard feelings between members of Congress, the Senate, House of Representatives, and how are we going to rule ourselves? The House of Representatives is going to be considered the people's firewall. That's really what this is. Congress itself is is the people's firewall. How's that working for us today? Anyone want to weigh in on that one? Not working out too well, is it? And so interesting here. Okay, well, we won't have Congress elect the president. And besides putting ill feelings between congressmen, we do not want undue influence coming from overseas and influencing our Congress, senators and representatives in choosing a president. That we don't want. Okay, so what are we going to do now? How about the state legislators? How about the state legislators who are elected by the people in 13 individual states? How about them? How about them deciding who the president's going to be? They rejected this. And the reason they rejected this is because they understood, like in 1776, when they had the Declaration of Independence as a unifier for revolution, we're still talking about 13 semi-autonomous entities. And so if you get a president beholden to a few of the, like let's say you got a president elected from the South, is he going to be beholden to the southern states and not the northern states? Are we looking to fracture the country here? Okay, we can't have that. And so that idea will be shot down. Okay, well, another idea. How about popular vote? How about the mass of people themselves voting for the president? Okay, that's fine, but the common man has to be checked. And not only that, again, now we're getting back to that point where the states are not all the same size and not every state has the same amount of people. And here's where it gets a little dicey here. When you look at each state, no matter how big, how small, how many people in each state, how few people in each state has 2 senators. They all have 2 senators. The senators are to represent the interests of that state, not so the House. Again, you have more people in certain states, less people in others. Well, that means considering there's more people in certain states and maybe the state physically is larger, you're going to have more districts. That means some states are going to have more representatives to the House, some states not as many. And so they're going to come up with a plan here by which these electoral votes will be decided on how many senators and representatives come from each state. For instance, today, Connecticut has what? 7 electoral votes. We have 2 senators and 5 elective districts, which means we have 5 representatives to the House of Representatives. And I'm old enough to remember when we had 6 reps. They cut us down. We used to have 8 electoral votes. We now have 7. That's some years ago. Yet compare yourself to California. California, look at the size of California, where we have maybe 3.5 million people, round numbers. What does California have? Round numbers, 40 million? And look at the size. They have 55 electoral votes. Again, 2 senators like Connecticut, but 53 elective districts. That's 53 members to the House of Representatives, as opposed to Connecticut, which has 5 representatives in the House. Now, one would think, well, now it's out of balance. As we go along here, you're going to see it's not quite as out of balance as you think. Interesting how the founders figured this out. And so, depending on what state you have, what state you're from, you could have more electoral votes than another state. However, interestingly enough, when you look at your Constitution and how this is laid out, and I'm going to read a little bit of this, and I'll do it slow so you get it, because I'm reading this, I'm not there. United States Constitution, Article 2, Section 1. This is 1787. The executive power shall be invested in a president of the United States of America, and he'll hold his term for 4 years. Now, keep in mind, there are no term limits at this stage. 4 years, so you can run for re-election. There are no term limits. You don't get that until Roosevelt, you know, after his term of office. However, interestingly enough, showing you how the power of suggestion can work, our first president, George Washington, serves 2 terms, and yet he voluntarily gave up after the 2nd term. Of course, if it was up to him, he wouldn't even have served as president, but because he wanted to go home. But he left, he went home. This really starts this tradition that lasted from when he left office, 1795-96, when John Adams became president, to the advent of Franklin D. Roosevelt. What a tradition. We didn't have to make it a law. Presidents just naturally left office after 2 terms if they got a 2nd term. That speaks well for this country and its political structure. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Each state shall appoint, this is Article 2, again, Article 2, Section 1. Each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature may thereof direct a number of electors equal to the number of senators and representatives from the state they may be entitled to in Congress. Again, fast forwarding to today, we are allowed 7 electoral votes and California 55. As big as Maine is, they've only got 4. You know, they only have 4 electoral votes. Nebraska, that's not a small state, has 5. Has 5. And I mentioned those 2 states because before we're done, I'm gonna explain their part here in this Electoral College College discussion. The electors. Oh, no sitting senator and no sitting representative may be an elector. Or if you're in trust, it says, or if you're a person holding office or trust or profit under the United States government, cannot be appointed as an elector. You cannot be an elected official. You can be an elected official, maybe from your state, but not nationally. You can't be part of the federal government and be an elector. That doesn't look right. You know that's where that's going to go. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons. Each elector in each state will vote for 2 persons. Now, the way they have this set up, of whom at least one shall not be an inhabitant of the state you're from. In other words, as an elector, you as an elector can cast 2 votes for a candidate for the presidency. One of them cannot be from your state. Well, you know what that can lead to. Favoritism, right? You want the local boy to be the president. Well, you can get 2 votes, but one has to be from outside your state. Now, when you take a look at the country back then, you don't think George Washington's not going to be popular? Of course he is. Of course he is. But that's how they set this. And they shall make a list. Each state, these electors shall make a list of all the persons voted for, and the number of votes for each, which list they shall sign and send to the president of the Senate. So each state has to collect from these electors who they're voting for, how many votes were cast, and this has to be sent to the president of the Senate of the United States. The president of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open up all these certificates from these states, and the votes shall then be counted. The whole number of electors appointed, and if there be more than one who have such majority and have equal number of the votes, then the House of Representatives shall immediately choose by ballot one of them for president. In other words, if all these electors have cast their votes after the popular vote, if they've cast their votes, whoever is the leader, the vote getter for president, if that person has one more than the electoral votes needed to be elected, he becomes president. Well, now the question becomes, what happens to the other vote getters? The person who finishes second becomes vice president. That's how your founders figured this out in the beginning. Keep in mind, we're talking about a country at this point. This is pre-party. There were no parties. Keep in mind, there are no presidential conventions. Well, look at it. Where are you going? There's no campaigning. You are looking at a country at this point where the presiding dogma really was, you didn't look for office. The office sought you. That's the kind of country you live in at this point. Pre-party, no conventions, nobody's really on the stump. That's not what's going on here. That's not what's going on here. It's a different country, but it's just founded. And so the person who got the most electoral votes will become the president. The person with the second electoral vote count will be the vice president. And that will lead to a problem, because how do you know they're going to get along? You don't. You don't. Interesting where this goes. Now, fact of the matter is, if nobody gets the required amount of electoral votes, well, how do you figure that one out? The founders stated the vote goes back to the House. Now, as I just explained, not all these states are the same size. Some have more people than others. That means they are going to have more representatives, more people in the House of Representatives. Remember, every state has 2 senators, but some states have more representatives to the House. It doesn't seem fair. Yes, it does, because according to the Constitution, once the election's thrown back to the House, no matter how big, how small, how populated, the scarcity of population, each state delegation gets 1 vote. So California and Connecticut will be equal. However, let's look at something. What kind of state would you rather be in this situation? Connecticut, where they have to have a discussion among seven people, or 55 before you reach an agreement on who you agree for president? That's the situation. That's the situation. So it's interesting here how the founders figured this out. And if there is, now let's say somebody does get the nod here and becomes president. Now, supposing there's a tie, keep in mind, they can actually vote in the House for the top 5 vote getters if there are 5. Okay, supposing Joe here wins the nomination. He becomes the president. Supposing number 2 and number 3 are tied with votes. Well, how do you, with electoral votes? Well, how do you figure that one out? That gets thrown back into the Senate, and the Senate will decide the tie. That's how they figured this out. It sounds like a convoluted process, but there is the devil's in the details, yes, but there's a necessity for it. There's a necessity for it. They are trying to keep maybe the common man in this equation of voting, but at the same time, they are not relying on the common man because many of them don't trust them. They don't think, many thought the common man wasn't educated enough to decide who the leader of the country should be. And if you look at the country today, I will give you a statistic. Half the American public is on an 8th grade reading level or less. Now, if that doesn't give you cause for concern, I don't know what will. You actually think you're going to have a functioning system of representative government. There's a discussion for you. That's for another time, perhaps. But at this point, you are seeing your founders, and they're making this up as they go along. They are trying to put this to, give them credit for this. They are making this up as they go along. Now, these electors, I read where a historian equated them to the College of Cardinals at the Vatican. Aren't they the ones that decide who the Pope's going to be? My take on that is, I am not so convinced of that, because do the rank and file of the Catholic religion get a chance to vote on who the Pope's going to be? And so the College of Cardinals does not act as a check on the mass of the Catholic faithful. However, your founders also considered Rome. Understand something about Rome within the Republic. Within Rome, okay, you had your Roman senators. The Roman senators would come up with legislation. Well, how was it passed? In Rome, based on different classes, they had something known as centuries. Now you get to where this term comes from, or one of the derivatives of this term. The voters were put into blocks of 100, depending on class. Each block of 100 got 1 vote. And so they would vote on whether to accept legislation from the senators or not. This is part of the Roman Republic. And so when your founders are putting together your republic, they hearken back to Rome as well. They also took a look at Greek democracy, and it didn't last long, which is something your founders eventually crossed out. They didn't think democracy, that was one of the aspects that they consulted, and didn't think your democracy here would last. Again, they didn't trust the people. But with the Roman Republic, that's fascinating. The blocks of 100, each block of 100 gets 1 vote. Well, what happens here when the House of Representatives has to decide the Electoral College here, the lack of the public putting somebody in office? Well, they didn't get the electoral votes. We have to decide, but each state gets 1 vote. So they hearken back to the Roman Republic really to get this. I find this fascinating. I really do. I mean, your founders consulted all of this. Thomas Hobbes, Edmund Burke, they checked Montesquieu, Rousseau, so on and so forth. But the Roman Republic, interesting here what they're figuring out here as they go along. However, at the same time in 1796, you will have an election. And it's going to be here, John Adams, who's going to win the presidency. He's a Federalist. He's from the Federalist Party. He will win the election. There were other Federalists in the race too, but they don't get the electoral votes. Guess who finishes second here? Thomas Jefferson. He's a Democrat Republican. Now you are going to have a Federalist president and a Democrat Republican for vice president. Interesting where this is going here. William L. Smith, a representative from South Carolina. introduced a resolution on the floor of the House of Representatives, urging an amendment be applied to the Constitution. Thereafter, electors would cast 2 votes, one for president and the other for vice president. That resolution died on the floor. However, something along those lines is going to reappear here in 1800. Keep in mind, John Adams will serve only 1 term. And you know from history in 1800, it's Thomas Jefferson who will be really the 3rd president. But how did he get to be the third president? There's the story here. Jefferson was a Democrat-Republican. Aaron Burr, remember him? Killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. He was also running for president. Neither Jefferson nor Burr had the required amounts of votes, electoral votes, to win the presidency. So the election gets thrown back into the House. And again, you're seeing your republic in action here. Now, interesting what's going on here. This system was supposed to try to prevent this, seeming deals that are seamy, backroom deals, backstabbing among those involved in trying to fathom out who's going to be the president here. And Alexander Hamilton, and you know from history, Hamilton and Jefferson were not really buddies, and yet Alexander Hamilton hated Aaron Burr, and he's going around to the different representatives in the House, don't vote for Burr, you got to vote for Jefferson. But anyway, the fact of the matter is Jefferson's going to win, but you know how many roll call votes they went through? 36. 36 roll call votes, and there's a lot of backroom, there's a lot of deals being made here. But it took 36 roll call votes before Jefferson won the election. But your republic worked here. It might seem like a convoluted process, but it works. Imagine that being done today. Wow. Yeah, somebody just rolled their eyes there. Somebody just rolled their eyes. So what happened? Well, it finally dawns on some of the people in Congress that perhaps, just perhaps, people, if you have even from the same party, that maybe the person who lost to become vice president won't want to work with the person that became president. So now they're going to go back to the drawing board, and they're going to come out with the 12th Amendment added to the Constitution, ratified in 1804. And so now you are going to see now people actually voting now for slates, president and vice president. You are now seeing a system that began without parties now being taken control of people who are now members of parties. And I will draw your attention, folks, to George Washington in his farewell address. If you get a chance, read it. It's one of the greatest farewell addresses ever given. He warned against unbridled military. He also warned against parties. He was not a man in favor of parties, and he thought that parties, too many parties worked against the government. And he thought that you will always find in political parties those who will opt to be loyal to the precepts of the party instead of the precepts of the nation. That's George Washington. He was not a fan of political parties. This is what you're seeing develop here. Fascinating what you're seeing. But again, that 12th Amendment, when it's ratified 1804, again, the electors shall meet in their respective states. They shall cast their ballots for who they want as president and vice president. Again, who the loser now is not going to be the vice president. You are now going to be voting actually for two people, but a president and a vice president. And instead of 5 choices, if that election gets thrown back into the House, they only go for the 3 top vote getters. That's it. We go from 5 to 3. And so interestingly enough, and then you have in 1961. You know, you really don't have any, except for getting the black man to vote in 1870, the 15th Amendment, and women voting in 1920, the 19th Amendment, which this month is the 100th anniversary thereof, August 26, 1920, 100th anniversary of the woman's right to vote. You see here another amendment applied for voting, which affects the Electoral College in 1961. It's the 23rd Amendment, to which at every presidential voting cycle, DC, the District of Columbia, which is not a state, although there are some who are trying to make this a state, but the 23rd Amendment gives Washington statehood for a presidential election. DC will have 2 senators, but 1 rep, so they get 3 electoral votes. However, interesting as history proceeds here, how your elections go here with the Electoral College or without the Electoral College. And I will draw your attention to 1824. Now, most people know that Andy Jackson was president from 1828 to 1836, but he ran for president in 1824. He could have been elected in 1824. Interesting, what happens? 4 people here running, or the 4 top vote getters are all from the same party, Democrat, Republican. And you needed 131 electoral votes to get elected. And after all the votes are counted, Andy Jackson had 99 electoral votes. John Quincy Adams, 84. The other 2 were William Crawford and Henry Clay. Now, those 2 will eventually bow out because they know they're not going to win at this point, and Congress is not going to entertain them voting, them getting in. However, again, when it's thrown back to the House, Andy Jackson, who had a 15 electoral vote lead when the votes were counted, will not become president. John Quincy Adams will become president in 1824. And Jackson will lose the election. Interesting, Jackson had 151,271 votes to Adams' 113,122. This is brought up by people saying, well, what good is it? What good is the Electoral College when the top vote getter by popular vote cannot get to the office? But they did not get, none of these candidates got the required electoral votes when the popular election was affected. So it got thrown back into the House. But again, that's the people's house. It was decided in the House of Representatives. 1876. Now, the 1876 election's an interesting one. We're in the midst of Reconstruction at this point. And the Southerners are not liking the fact that Northern troops are on the streets. Well, what's going to happen in 1876? What makes this election so important? Mainly because it's Rutherford B. Hayes, Republican, running against Samuel J. Tilden from New York. And when the votes, and as the votes were being counted here, Samuel Tilden actually had 184 electoral votes. To Rutherford B. Hayes, 165. He's got him by 19. And so Tilden's 184 electoral votes, he only needs 1 more. He has to hit 185 and he wins the presidency. 3 states come into question here: Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Again, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina. Where are those states? The old Confederacy, right? Right. In each of these states, Democrats and Republicans, keep in mind that there's no Democrat-Republican anymore. It's the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, Lincoln's Republican Party. Keep in mind, both declared that their candidate won the state. Well, you can't have an election like this. So it should have been thrown back into the House. It won't be. The Southerners are so hot to trot to get federal troops out of the South, they're going to make a deal with the northern politicians. Hey, look, we'll give you Republicans the White House, but you get federal troops out of the South. This is called the Compromise of 1876, 1877. And 1877, Northern troops will leave the South. And the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation for blacks down South, what do you think happened to that? What do you think happened to blacks down South? Well, you had what? Jim Crow laws, you're gonna, the Ku Klux Klan coming. Yeah, so the Southerners got a lot of what they wanted by getting Northern troops out. And by the way, that election, 1876, interesting the results, Hayes got his 185 electoral votes. Tilden had 184. However, Hayes got 4,034,311 popular votes in 21 states. Tilden, 184 electoral votes, but 4,288,546 popular votes in 17 states. He got the popular vote narrowly, but he lost the electoral vote count. Does it sound familiar? Yes, it should. 1888. Oh, and by the way, that 1876 election, get a load of this, 81.8% of eligible voters turned out to vote in that election. 81.8%. Do you hear tallies like that anymore? No, I don't think so. 1888, Democrat Grover Cleveland, the incumbent, lost to a Republican challenger. Interesting, Cleveland carries 18 states and Harrison carried 20 states. But interesting here, Cleveland had 168 electoral votes and he had 5,534,000 votes versus the winner, Harrison, who had 233 electoral votes, 5,443,000 votes. He won by less than 100,000 votes out of the over 10 million cast. Fascinating, fascinating. But the system, for the most part, does work. You know, so this what they call the Electoral College is really not a place. It's just a system of electors. But each state chooses their own electors. The problem with the system now, when some people say, well, let's get rid of the system. Going back to the founding of the country, Alexander Hamilton, who was a booster of this, thought, you know, when choosing, each state is going to choose their electors. How they choose it is up to the state. And I mentioned this was a sop. This was something thrown for states' rights. Because again, you're talking about colonies becoming states, which jealously guarded their local traditions, their autonomy, so on and so forth. But they would become part of this nation. But they had to give up, but the federal government, you know, correcting a federal government, you have to give up something, states' rights. However, at the same time here, as parties become prevalent, and today it's how it is, do you honestly think, do you choose the electors in the state of Connecticut? No, who chooses them? Democrats and Republicans, right? And when do they choose them? Do they consult you? Are they going to allow a popular vote in this state? Are they going to allow the voters to choose the electors? You think they're going to allow? No, they're not going to allow that. So who are they going to pick? It's the Democrats and Republicans that choose the electors, and you honestly think they're going to pick the most intelligent out of the voting public in the state of Connecticut to act as a check on them? If you believe they believe in the Easter Bunny, that's just not going to happen. So they will pick the electors. They can pick previously elected officials in the state of Connecticut. They can pick people who maybe work for the Democrat or Republican parties. They can pick people. They will pick generally those who are going to support the candidates put forth. And when do they do this? Well, it could be done at the party conference. It could be done. It could be done just before the election. But the parties will pick the electors. Keep in mind here, whether you realize it or not, when you vote, like let's say the last election, you voted for maybe Hillary or Tom Kaine or maybe Trump and Pence, right? Well, you're not only voting for those two, whatever you're Democrat, you're voting for Hillary Clinton or Tom Kaine. You're not only voting for them, you are also voting for their 7 electors. You're voting for 9 people, not 2. Keep in mind how this is going to work. You know, the election is usually the first in November is usually the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That's how they used to say it. The electors, after the popular vote is done, will meet the first Monday after the second Wednesday of December. So they meet halfway through December, in other words. They will cast their votes. Usually these electors will cast their vote. If they're Democrats, well, they're going to cast their votes for Hillary and Kaine. If they're Republicans, they're going to cast their votes for Trump and Pence. Although there were a few people here who were what they call faithless electors. But that really has never really inhibited the process. So, and it's up to the parties, really. It's up to the states, but really up to the parties. How do you punish a faithless elector? What, do you banish them from the party? Do you fine them? That's up to the parties to do that. That's not up to elected officials. It's up to the parties to do this. But what happens here is this. Once the votes are cast by the electors, the parties fill out certificates of vote. All the people who voted are on this list, as well as the candidates. That's handed into the Secretary of State of the state. This will all be sent to the governor, who has to look at this too. And then both certificates of vote are handed in. And then the Secretary of State is going to come up with an ascertainment. I think it's called an ascertainment of vote. These are all filled out. They all have the candidates involved, and they all have the electors. Keep in mind that information is available to you. All you have to do is contact Hartford, and you can get this information. You can get the names of the electors. It's not that this is a secret. They just don't appear on the ballot. They just don't appear on the ballot. But think about it. When you vote for your presidential candidate and the vice presidential candidate on the slate, you're also voting for the electors. Because keep in mind, Hillary won this state. She is the one we're going to report as the victor of the state of Connecticut. So the electors for Trump no longer apply. The electors for Hillary are the ones that will be counted. This will be sent to 2 places, to the President of the Senate, as well as the National Archives and Records Administration, which will keep these records, by the way, and they do so election in and election out. You can go to NARA, or the National Archives and Records Administration, and you can fathom through, you can filter through the records and find out who the electors were 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever you want to do. You can actually go there and petition to see these records. It's a fascinating process if you want to do that. But today, the electors are picked by the parties. Now, what does this do? It also allows Democrats and Republicans to more control the elective process at the expense of maybe, I don't know, the Greens, the Socialists, the Constitutional Party, the Independents, the Communists. And I bring up the Communists because if you remember, if you're old like I am, if you're old enough to remember when the Communists used to run Gus Hall for president every time there was a run for the White House. He never won, of course. Do you know in 2016, the Communist Party USA did not field a candidate. They backed one of the candidates. They backed Hillary Clinton in 2016. Now, I'm sure if Hillary decides she wants to run again in 2020, I don't think she's going to put down as a reference the Communist Party USA. I don't think that's going to happen. But the fact of the matter is the communists voted for her because they weren't going to vote for Trump. So it's interesting how your politics make strange bedfellows. Yet today, you know, you had the election in 2000, which Democrats rail about. You know, the sticking point here was Florida. Here, the Electoral College, the Supreme Court will get involved. It was George Bush Jr. against Al Gore. Al Gore was the sitting vice president, being the VP for Bill Clinton. And the sticking point here was Florida. They went through a number of vote counts in Florida until finally the Supreme Court stepped in and decided this in favor of George Bush. Now keep in mind here, George Bush did get 50,546,000 votes. He had 500. He got the 271 electoral votes, but Al Gore had 50,999,000 votes. This is an extremely close election, and he wound up with how many electoral votes? 266. Bush won by 5 electoral votes. Yet that election did not see the House of Representatives. It was decided by the Supreme Court. And yet Democrats at the same time, and now here's where Gore really should have pushed the agenda here about another vote recount. That's very close. 50,999,000, 50,456,000. That's close. Out of 100 million votes cast, wouldn't you want to recount? I would. I mean, I'd really push the envelope here. Yet, what do Democrats do? They vilify Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader got 2.7% of the vote. Why vilify Ralph Nader? Because Gore didn't. If Gore was that good of a candidate, he would have won hands down anyway. Apparently, he wasn't that good of a candidate. Then you go back to 2016. Again, the Democrats lost. Trump wins the election. Interestingly enough, the Democrats lost the 3 states they thought they really had in their pocket: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And it's not like Trump won those states by landslides. That's not the case. The case here is Hillary lost 3 states she thought she, or the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, thought she was going to get. She didn't get them. And I don't know about you, but I talked to a number of people who wanted Bernie Sanders. And I remember some of them telling me, well, since the DNC didn't let Sanders win the nomination, I'm not voting for Hillary. Guess who they're going to vote for? Trump. Trump. Well, there's other ramifications as to why he won, and this talk does not go into that. But the fact of the matter is, in the end, interesting, the vote count. Trump got 304 electoral votes and 62,979,000 and change votes. Hillary got 227 electoral votes and 65,844,000 votes. She got just about 2.9 million more votes, yet she lost. And so we see that this backlash to the Electoral College has accelerated here. To me, whether they get rid of the Electoral College or not at this stage, to me, I really don't have a dog in this race, except for one thing. I do not agree. In fact, I got picked going on, it was the spring of 2017. I got picked by the League of Women Voters to be one of 4 panelists on a forum. That was this topic, the Electoral College. And one of the panelists was Hendrik Hertzberg, who is was a nationally syndicated columnist at the New Yorker magazine. Another was Pam Norman. She was a big noise with the League of Women Voters and the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact people up in Massachusetts. And the other one was Luther Weeks. And I always tell people, Luther Weeks is a good speaker. And I always urge places when they ask about who do you like, who do you think we should get to speak? And I always say Luther Weeks. Luther Weeks was the 4th panelist. Luther Weeks is a retired software engineer. His lot in life is that he travels our state and audits elections. And if anyone knows the rules and regulations of voting, it's Luther. Extremely nice fella, knows what he's talking about with regards to the rules and regulations of voting. And we were the 4 panelists. Now, Hertzberg and Norman were for the compact. Their argument was, well, every vote's going to count. Every vote will now count, because how they have it structured here, how they believe it should be structured, being part of that compact, is that they believe that the popular vote is counted and the electoral votes are applied after the fact, but we go by popular vote. Well, if you look at most of your elections, that's how it's been working anyway. That's how it's been working anyway. Interesting here, they think once they get enough states on board to agree to the compact, once you get 270 electoral votes among states that favor the compact, we automatically go to the system. It's a voluntary system. My question was, supposing you have 200 states, enough states on board where you have 271 electoral votes, and we go with your system. What if it's voluntary? Supposing Maine opts out, and you're down to 267 electoral votes. Now we're back to the old system. Where's the continuity here? To me, that leads to confusion. Besides, if you read Article 1, Section 10 of the United States Constitution, it states quite clearly in black and white that interstate compacts are illegal, unless they're okayed by Congress, really. And so calling this the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, to me, the wording is not really conducive to trying to make a functioning system of representative government. To me, at this stage of the game, the republic doesn't exist anymore anyway. We're really a corporate state. So what we're talking about, it doesn't make any difference whether you go with the popular vote solely or you go with the Electoral College. In fact, in Greenwich, we did this at the Greenwich. These panels were held in two places. One was the Westport Playhouse. The other was the Greenwich Library, that big auditorium they have, something like they have at the Darien Library. And we had 180, 200 people here at these panels. And of course, you open it up to the public. And there was one fella in Greenwich sitting down near the front. And he looked at Hertzberg and Norman and he says, "You're telling me that my vote is going to count. Once we get rid of the Electoral College, my vote's going to count." "Oh yeah, it will count." And he says, "I don't believe it." He says, "I don't believe my vote counts now. And I don't believe it's going to count if we go to a decidedly popular vote system." And so I put my hand up, and the moderator, who is Victoria Bassetti, who's a nationally syndicated columnist, says, "Yeah, Mark, go right ahead." So this gentleman, and I said, "Sir," I said, "let me ask you a question. All right, if you compare Connecticut with California, from what you're saying here, compare Connecticut with California. Connecticut has about 3.5 million people, 7 electoral votes." I said, "California has 55 electoral votes, 2 senators for 53 reps." But I said, "California also has some 40 million people. California also has Silicon Valley. They've got international shipping ports. They've got international airports. They have oil. They have natural gas. They've got the 1st Marine Division at Camp Pendleton. They've got the Navy base in San Diego." So I said, "What you're telling me, the Electoral College or popular vote, it doesn't make any difference. If you have so much money to campaign, where are you going first? Are you going to California or Connecticut?" And he says, "California." I said, "Concur." And that was the end of the discussion. So it doesn't make any difference. If people have so much money to run, what states do you think they're going to? They're going to California. They're going to go to Texas. They're going to go to Ohio. They're going to go to Michigan. They're going to go to Florida. You get the picture here? They're going to go to where most of the people are, where maybe some of the resources are. Yeah, that's where they're going. You think they're coming to Connecticut? What's here in Connecticut? I mean, I like Connecticut, but geez, And so interesting here what you see. And then Luther Weeks brought up a good point. He said, if you're going, he was pro Electoral College. He says, what some of you people don't understand is if we bypass the Electoral College, he said, going with the popular vote, do you understand they were still counting votes in the 2016 election well into December in California? When are you going to find out the results? January? February, he says, keep in mind, we have 50 states, and each state has different rules and regulations of voting. My take on the Electoral College is, well, if we need to get rid of it, okay, but that should be up to the people. Let's have your representatives try to pass legislation in Congress. If the legislation passes both houses of Congress, then it has to be thrown back to the states. And if 38 of the 50 states pass it, it becomes an amendment to the United States Constitution. That's how you get amendments applied. That's rule of law. That's rule of law. And so personally, I've seen enough of bypassing the Constitution. Do presidents go before Congress and ask for a declaration of war anymore? No. Does Congress really have power of the purse anymore? No. Does the NSA really have the right to abscond with your phone numbers, your phone records, and your emails? Number one, the NSA, their charter is for foreign espionage only, not domestic. And that violates the Fourth Amendment. Aren't you supposed to be secure in your person and your belongings? Of course you are, unless they have a warrant to search. Okay, I'll give you that. But warrantless? No, so we need to go back to the Constitution and Bill of Rights. The Constitution is our blueprint for government. And your Bill of Rights are your protections against the infringement of government. That's how the founders laid this out. Now, I'll admit, some of your founders were large landowners. I'll give you that. But they were also something that I think that's never really discussed. They were enlightened authoritarians. They didn't want the common man to run the country, but they were willing to give you a part in running the country. And especially when you look at your revolution, I know I got this stuff thrown at me too when I was a kid. Oh, it was for liberty, freedom, human rights, civil rights. Bunk. The most important one was economic rights, the possibility of owning land. Go back to John Adams again. The wide ownership of land is conducive to a functioning system of representative government. It doesn't make a hoot and hell of difference whether you got a quarter of an acre or 1,000 acres. If you own land, you are a property owner. Because property has been, is, and always will be a determinant for power. Anybody have any questions or comments or observations to make? The recent Supreme Court decision with regards to the Electoral College, I haven't read that decision yet, and I am going to read that decision. And when I do, I will be ready to make a comment that I think I need to make. But until I read that decision, I am not going to stick my neck out and say something that's not really true. Yeah, well, the parties have been doing that for God knows how long. But faithless electors have really not been a real issue for the most part. And they're for the most part, they're rare. And so if they're going to talk about the faithless elections with the Electoral College, why don't we get into a discussion as to, if you're going to get rid of the Electoral College, why don't we get into the notion of going through the Constitution instead of just going through a number. Once 270 is hit, we just change the system. That's not rule of law. And the Supreme Court needs to protect rule of law. Well, some people, Charles, have stated that maybe what they do in Maine and Nebraska is the answer, proportional. In other words, if you, like in Maine, there's 4 electoral votes, 2 senators and 2 districts. Now, you can win the state and get the 2 senators or those 2 votes. You win 1 district, it's not winner take all. Everything in 48 states is winner take all. In Maine and Nebraska, it's not. So you can still win the state, you get the 2 senatorial votes, you might win one of the districts, but you lose 1 district. So you don't get the 4 votes, you get 3. Nebraska, same way. You've got 3 districts in the state the size of Nebraska, but you've also got the 2 senators, so they got 5 electoral votes. But these are states that are not exceedingly populated. So in Nebraska, again, in Nebraska too, look at Nebraska. If you win the state, and let's say you do, you get the 2 of the senatorial votes, but let's say you overwhelmingly win one of the districts and you lose by a close vote count in the other 2. Now, out of 5 electoral votes, you get 3. Wow. Now, some people have stated, well, maybe we ought to make that national policy. Well, maybe, but how is that going to delay the election as we verify the votes in these districts if we go to proportional voting? That's probably going to entail more vote counting. And so maybe, Charles, we're back to maybe what you're intimating here, that maybe we're not going to get rid of it. The other side of the coin here is, and I didn't mention this before, is that when you look at some of the most populous states that have most of the electoral votes per state, again, and I'm not sure if some minorities have figured this out. Where do most of the minorities live? I'm talking about Blacks and Latinos. New York, Florida, Ohio, Michigan, California, Texas. So maybe the Electoral College more so can work for them as long as it survives. So it's interesting here, and maybe this is a gem in the, maybe this is a diamond in the rough for some of the minorities here. You know, they ought to look at that too. So it's interesting how the numbers play out here. It's interesting. I mean, you could slice this every which way to Sunday, but it's interesting how the numbers play out. But I can understand where some people get frustrated that, yes, gee whiz, Joe Blow got 50 million votes and Billy got 49.5, and Billy won because he had a couple of extra electoral votes. Well, again, your founders didn't trust the common man. And they thought they could rein in the excesses of the mass by arranging this system. That's what they thought. Of course, let's understand something. The country, when it's formed, has 3 million people. How many does it have now? 335 million, I guess, is the accepted number. And you had 13 states, not 50. So times have changed too. And again, when this system is formed, you didn't have parties at the very beginning of the country. Now you do. Well, what the Electoral College does, and I don't think this is really brought up enough, is that it helped, going back to the founders again, they were putting together a federated system. And so this system of federalism, the Electoral College helps to keep the federal system. Think about it, Harris. If you didn't have that, you went by the popular vote. Let's say you got rid of the Electoral College, you go with the popular vote totally. Think about this for a moment, that maybe a dominant region could take control of the White House. Yeah. Keep in mind, you know, part of this is because of the Electoral College. Remember JFK when he ran, when he was the president, when he got to be president. But what did he do to make sure he got the South, those electoral votes? He took on Johnson. Mm-hmm. And so you see here this ability to bind the country with the Electoral College or the electoral vote count. Again, it has its advantages, perhaps. It also has its drawbacks, like anything else man does. So when we're going to talk about getting rid of it, I think we need to take all the ramifications involved and digest these before we make a decision saying, well, we're going to get rid of it. What's the cost? What are the penalties here? But again, 3 million people when the country's formed, 335 million now. And so to say, well, we're going to get rid of it because it's old, that's not an answer. That's not an answer. But the point you bring up to me is a strong one. It's got to be done through the Constitution. That's rule of law. And that's what we have to abide by. I mean, you're born here, you have to abide, to me, you have to abide by it. But I mean, I'm sure Democrats and Republicans have been doing this for quite some time, and they're going to make sure they vet the people they want to be the electors. And they don't want faithless electors. That doesn't mean that system's going to be foolproof. You know, it's not going to be foolproof. But Democrats and Republicans have been pretty savvy on, for the most part, overwhelmingly so, picking people that are going to abide by the party line. And plus, if you're an elector, you want to be ostracized? No, I don't think so. Unless you're really wedded to unless you're really an idealist and you're wedded to your ideal. But for the most part, you know, these so-called faithless electors, for when you take into account as many elections as we've had, they appear once every Halley's Comet. So to me, this isn't really an issue here. It really isn't. But the viability of the Electoral College is really the issue. That's really the issue here. Well, they'll follow the party precepts, but keep in mind, in most elections, the Electoral College the electoral votes are applied after the popular vote. I mean, take the elections of Franklin D. Roosevelt. I mean, especially the 32 election when he became president in 33. Of course, Hoover has a depression to contend with. It's not surprising he lost. But is there a problem here with the electoral votes? No. Roosevelt crushed them. And so, you know, so the electoral votes here are going to really be applied per the popular vote. And so in most cases, the popular vote really decides the elections. Right. It's again, we're not talking a foolproof system. You know, it's not foolproof. Man made it. But at the same time here, interesting what you see as well here with the Electoral College, going back to how I said it might help string the country together, because if somebody from the Northeast, going back to the Kennedy being the president, he's pulling somebody from Texas to be the vice president, so he makes sure he gets the South and Southwest. The others, and I brought up the fact too that maybe minorities, if they understood this better, if the Electoral College can benefit them politically, because a lot of the states that have a lot of electoral votes contain what? Minority populations. How many blacks you're going to find in Vermont? How many blacks you're going to find in New Hampshire? You know, that's some of where you are here. And so many of the minorities are in these states where they have a lot of electoral votes. Perhaps if they better organize themselves, they could take advantage of that situation. So that could be a diamond in the rough for them. But of course, many minorities have affiliated themselves with parties anyway. But, you know, blacks have been affiliated with Democrats for a long time, so on and so forth. That's all part of your politics, your political makeup of the country. So it's interesting here. How what they call the Electoral College factors in to our voting every year. No, well, you know, yeah, we've had elections before where in states where the election was close, you've counted the votes, then you have to recount them. Now we got to go through this again. And I know from talking to Luther Weeks, he says, Mark, I've drank so much coffee at some of these vote counts because you don't count them just once. You might have to count them a second time, a third time. That's all part of the process here because you want to be as exact as possible. When you go back to no term limits, you were asking about term limits. It seems like, to start with the presidency, George Washington, who most revered back then, he did 2 terms. So we'll abide by what the tradition Washington started. And that's going to last until FDR becomes president. You're really not going to see any term limits for anybody in the House or the Senate. However, back then, you know, today we have what's known as career politicians. And I don't know about you, but there's more money around today than there was in 1787, 1794, 1784, 1794, 1796, so on and so forth. Well, you know, I wouldn't discount totally what you're saying, Mark, because, you know, I've been of that school that maybe today we ought to limit a senator to 2 6-year terms, president 2 4-year terms. Maybe we ought to limit a representative to 4 2-year terms, and then you're out. You know, when it came to term limits, they really didn't really affect term limits. You know, George Washington just started a tradition. He was president twice and then bowed out. Andy Jackson, Keep in mind, Mark, you're talking about an era. We are no longer an agrarian nation as we were founded. We are now an industrialized capitalist state. And in 1933, and I've given talks on this, you had something known as the business plot. Because I have 113 pages of the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, the first House of Un-American Activities Committee, where there was a Wall Street fascist plot to unseat Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933, 1934, and it's Smedley Darlington Butler, a two-time Medal of Honor recipient from the Marine Corps, who blew the whistle on this to Congress. And the whole thing, the investigation will start, and names like the DuPonts, the Pitcairns, Morgan Interests, Remington Arms, elements of the American Legion, Guaranteed Bank and Trust, Wall Street, and even Roosevelt will help put an end to this because of the fact we're in the middle of a depression. Let's cure the depression. That will help cure our political differences and the nation will move on. But interestingly enough, we will still have our elections, 32, 33. We'll have our elections in 36. We'll have our election in 40. We don't skip a beat. The itself survives. It survives a depression. It survives a threat from a potential coup. It survives Nazism, fascism, and even Bolshevism. I mean, there was a fear that those ideas could become part of the American fabric in the 1930s. And yet our system of election will survive. And yet after Roosevelt wins a fourth term, we need to put an end to this, because that means what later on? Maybe a dictator? So there's a whole lot going on here politically in this country. But that period from the end of the First World War to 45 is a fascinating period in American history politically, and how we become more, and you know, and this idea of an industrialized state took off after 1865. You know, the Hamiltonian notion beat the Jeffersonian notion in the Civil War, so we've become an industrialized state. Agrarianism is going to the back burner. And so it's interesting where that leads your country. And all through this change, voting for your president, voting for your senators, voting for your House of Representatives, your rep, the Electoral College survived. The Electoral College survives 1914-18, survives the Depression, survives the Second World War, if you want to call it that, and the system survives. What does that say about the American system? Fascinating here what you say. And so when people say, well, let's get rid of the Electoral College, my point is, well, you better rethink that, because going back to, let's say, the Kennedy election again, Kennedy, Johnson, take a look at a place like Russia. They have elections, if you want to call them that, but they're usually Russians will win the high spots in any election, whether it's communist or not. And what happens to all the nationalities in the Russians? They are subservient to the Russians. Go back to Iraq. When Saddam was so-called president of Iraq, that was actually a republic. Iraq was a republic. It had a judiciary, it had a legislative branch, it had a president. But they also had the RCC, the Revolutionary Command Council. And all those people, Saddam, all those people, Hassan Bakir, all came from one city to Crete. So now you've got people from one city running an entire country that's supposed to be a republic. And the people in the RCC oversee anything, and any legislation passed in the legislative branch of the so-called Iraqi Republic had to be okayed by the RCC. We didn't have that here. So our system actually worked. So getting rid of the Electoral College, okay, but we need to go through the Constitution. But I think we need to take a look at all the ramifications of this before we just go headlong into something that we might be sorry for in the long run. Talking about the process itself, correct? The basic process itself. You've brought up a point, and in 1816, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Samuel Kercheval. And I've got this letter, it's an interesting letter. And in this letter he wrote, and I think he's admitting here that the founders made a mistake. that every 19 or 20 years, the country should have a constitutional convention to acclimate the founding documents to the present generation. Not being stupid, he understood that the country in 1787 is not going to be the same country in 1857. He understood this. And he also added, the present it's in the letter, the present belongs to the living and not the dead. I will add to that by saying, I think the founders made a mistake by not inserting into the fabric of the Constitution itself how we nominate people for higher office. Now the parties have taken that chore up themselves. And so to me, maybe, now this isn't set in stone obviously here because it didn't happen. But maybe if we have a nomination process free of political influence embedded in the blueprint for government, maybe, just maybe, we could eliminate or cut down on maybe political problems in the nominating process. Something that could have coincided perhaps with what, the Electoral College? Now, keep in mind the process itself. I mean, the process now, how long does the process last today? But then again, when you know, you're looking at a process that's now become an entity of its own. I mean, look at channels 247. This is a Super Bowl for them. How much money they're making? You didn't have that back in the day. You know, back in the day, I mentioned, how many cities did we have? There's no conventions. What kind of a road infrastructure do you have? People didn't campaign. Oh, they wrote commentaries in papers, almanacs, so on and so forth. But you didn't have the communications you have today. And so it's almost like, the office sought the man didn't seek the office. Today, it's the other way around because there's so many other ramifications applied to it. And especially when you have corporate influence, financial influence in your elections. Citizens United come to mind here. And so the longer they're campaigning, how much are they getting done? And I find that a problem. Yeah, that it does. I agree with you there. But then again, you and I can't afford to write the checks with a lot of zeros on them. We can't afford to do that. Not as many people can. And so, and your founders warned that undue wealth could undo the republic. Besides the fact, Washington warning, again, as I mentioned, parties bring out the worst in people. An over-bloated military, which Eisenhower will take up. You know, Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex, 1961, he's bouncing off what Washington warned about in 1796. And I find that interesting. Not only were they both presidents, they were both generals. So yes, you're talking about a different country, 1796 to today. But it's right, money has had a, you know, the squeakiest wheel gets oiled. So money is the grease. And you didn't have that as much back in the day. But the country is going to change anyway. But I still think that Jefferson was onto something when he said that every generation should have a constitutional convention to update the documents. In other words, get the people involved in changing how their government is, perhaps, to their situation. And I would add to that, that maybe the founders made a mistake by not putting the nomination process for office in our original blueprint for government, because we've left the parties to do that. That's reassuring. So, and I want to thank you for tuning in today. And again, if you have any questions or comments, you can go to my website, markwriter.org, and my contact points are there. And you're free to send me an email, whatever, if you want to. And I don't mind taking up the discussion after we close off here. I don't mind that at all. Don't mind it at all. Otherwise, have yourselves a tremendous evening and stay well.